All right, video number 2. We're going to give this one another whirl here. So we're talking about causes leading up to the Civil War. Biggest issue here, popular sovereignty. Popular, we know what that means. Sovereignty, extreme rule, right? Popular rule. Popular sovereignty comes down to the people. Popular rule, the people rule, right? The people are in charge. What they want is ideally supposed to happen, right? So popular sovereignty, big issue happening in the late 1840s, early 1850s. So we've got election 1848, right? We've got a Democrat, we've got a Whig, we've got the Free Soil Party, right? The calling of the Free Soil Party: free soil, free speech, free labor, free men, right? What does the Free Soil Party want, right? Free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. Is the Free Soil Party an anti-slavery party? No, right? They are not an anti-slavery party. The Free Soil Party is simply arguing that they don't want slaves on this new land, because if there's slaves on this land, the rich plantation owners are going to have it and they can't have it, right? So the Free Soil Party is anti-slavery because slavery hurts their bottom line. They're not anti-slavery from a moral standpoint. They're not anti-slavery necessarily in the South. They're anti-slavery in the expanded land. So, election 1848, big issues coming up. You still have the Mexican-American War kind of happening. You still have the Wilmot Proviso, right? If you remember, the Wilmot Proviso is saying that there's to be no slaves in the new territory that is gained from the Mexican-American War. So the big issue that's happening right now is slavery. Why do we care about slavery during this election? Because this is going to be the first election where people are going to discuss slavery. Up until this point in time, no one is discussing it because it's going to lose you votes. If you're pro-slavery, the anti-slavery side is not going to vote for you. If you're anti-slavery, the pro-slavery side is not going to vote for you. It's easier just not to discuss this topic, right? Why does this matter? Because in 1850, right, as the gold rush builds up, California is going to apply for statehood, right? And as we know, obviously California eventually becomes a state, but this is a biggie, right? With California wanting to come in, they're going to break the tie of 15 slave states, 15 free states, and this becomes a trying matter for Congress to figure out, what do we do with California? Because what we do with it may set the standard for what happens with states kind of coming forward. So we've got this increase in sectionalism, and you might say, why slavery, why now, right? Why was slavery not a big deal before? Big issue that's happening, Underground Railroad, right? Harriet Tubman, most of us have heard of the Underground Railroad before, but why is this a big deal? Between 1810 and 1850, about 100,000 slaves have escaped. 40 years, 100,000 slaves. That is a lot of slaves. Right? Why is this problematic again? Slaves are property. Slaves are money, right? We think of slaves as people. Slavery is wrong. Back then, if you lose a slave, you lose money. Not only can that slave not work for you, but you've lost money that you've invested, right? And that's problematic. These people want their slaves back. So what's going to eventually happen is, as we push towards the Compromise of 1850, people are now going to start pushing towards a stronger fugitive slave law. Fugitive slave law is something that's been in place all the way back since the end of the American Revolution when we drafted the Constitution. But people want it to actually be enforced right now. The fugitive slave law essentially says, if your slave escapes, go get it, right? Hire a slave catcher, let them go to the north, let them bring back your slave. And again, this is legitimate because that's your property. In theory, you should be able to get your property back. It's problematic because the law says when they get to a certain territory, they're free, right? And if they're free, you can't have them. So it's this big debate about, can we get them? Can we not get them? What happens if we capture them? The ultimate issue with this is the slave catchers want money. They get paid if they bring back the slave, right? If they go to the north and they're looking for Jim and they can't find Jim, but their Jim is 6'5" and weighs 210 pounds, and they find an African American that's 6'4" that weighs 190, close enough, right? The slave master, while he wants Jim back, he at the very least wants a slave back that is capable of doing Jim's work. So if you can't find Jim, grab someone. You might say, well, why doesn't that slave just say, or why doesn't an African American say, listen, I'm not a slave? Do we think that the courts actually care? No, right? There is something put in place during this time period where essentially if something goes to court, The judge is going to get $10 if he rules in favor of the white slave master, $5 if he rules in favor of the African American, right? Why would a white judge, one, take less money and risk the backlash from the white society for ruling against the white man? He's not going to. So the fugitive slave law is something that the white men, particularly in the South, are really pushing to get enforced. The North is pushing back against this. The North is going to pass the Personal Liberty Act, right? And the Personal Liberty Act is going to say, no, you can't come into the North, right? If you come into the North, we are going to arrest a slave catcher. We're going to consider taking a slave or an African American, bringing them back down south in free territory, kidnapping, right? So you have this is a clear crack. The North and the South have two different laws, legal laws that go against each other. One says you can do this, one says you can't do this, and it's a matter of figuring out how does the society exist when one part of your country says you can do this and another part says you can't, right? What's going to kind of increase this? Some of you wrote about Harriet Beecher Stowe in your reform movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a best-selling book that details how harsh slavery is. Now, we know slavery is bad, and most likely, in the back of the mind, a lot of Northern people knew that slavery was not a walk in the park. But when they wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, people in the North were able to read about whippings, about brutality, about the manner in which the long hours the slaves worked. And it was brought to their attention that this is not moral. You have to remember religion is a big part of people's lives during this time period. And when they read about the mistreatment of the slaves, this is going to invoke emotion, right? And when Harriet Beecher Stowe, for those of you that wrote about her, when she meets Abraham Lincoln, right, he tells her, so this is the little lady that started the great big war, right? Obviously, it's not just her that starts Civil War, but he deems that a lot of her book is partially to attribute to why people get so riled up and angry and want to start the Civil War. So Harriet Beecher Stowe is a big piece of this. We also have another book, right? Hilton R. Helper. He's going to write The Impending Crisis of the South, right? He hates both blacks and slavery, and he attempts to use statistics to prove that the non-slave holding whites were the ones who suffered the most from slavery. Right? So you have a point of view that is talking about how slavery is bad because it's immoral. And you have a point of view that's looking at slavery from an economic standpoint, right? The white farmers who don't own slaves or would be doing the work that the slaves are doing are losing out financially because the slaves are doing all their work, right? So you have two large arguments that are pushing towards white society saying, let's get rid of slaves. So then you have these issues that are going to come up. Brain freeze. Stephen Douglas, right? Stephen Douglas is going to run for Senate against Abraham Lincoln, right? In Illinois, 1858. He's going to defeat him. Stephen Douglas is a well-known politician. He's the one that comes up with the idea of popular sovereignty. Where does popular sovereignty get put into place? Kansas, Nebraska, right? He comes up with this idea under Kansas, Nebraska that we're going to vote popular sovereignty. We've got the Nebraska territory. The concern by the South is with the Nebraska territory, people are going to vote for Nebraska to be a free state. So he says, no problem, right? We'll split Kansas and Nebraska in half, or split Nebraska in half to create Kansas and Nebraska. We'll have popular sovereignty, problem solved, right? One side's going to pick slave state, one side's going to pick free state. We'll balance it out, right? No big deal. So that's his plan put into place. The problem is with Kansas, what's going to occur is you have two groups, right? The Northern Immigrant Aid Society, right? Northern Immigrant Aid Society, which is obviously coming from New England, right? And then you have the Border Ruffians, who are coming from Missouri, right? So the New England Immigrant Aid Society is going to come down to Kansas. The Border Ruffians are going to come over from Missouri. And you have two groups of people that do not live in Kansas, right? They have nothing to do with Kansas that are going to campaign, they're going to vote, they're going to threaten people, and they're going to fix the election. So it's not just the people in Kansas deciding, it's other people in the country. And eventually this is going to erupt into violence, right? You're going to have Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas is going to be a fight between the New England Immigrant Aid Society and the Border Ruffians. After what's going to happen, essentially, the Border Ruffians are going to go into the capital, which is in Lawrence, the capital of the the free kind of fighting or anti-slavery people in Kansas. They're going to go in there and they're going to kill people. They're going to burn buildings. They're going to burn the newspaper that was set up by the anti-slavery people, the abolitionist people. In response to this, John Brown's a white man who is extremely anti-slavery, and he deems that the only way you fix slavery, the violence of slavery, is with more violence. John Brown's going to respond. He's going to capture 5 border ruffians at night with his sons, and he's going to assassinate them. He's going to kill them, right? John Brown, furthermore, is eventually going to march onto Harper's Ferry, right? And he's got this plan. He's going to get slaves to help him. He's going to go to Harper's Ferry. He's going to gather their arsenal, and he's going to lead a rebellion. The problem is the slaves, either because they don't trust him, they don't understand him, they get scared by their slave master, they don't come. John Brown is left with his sons. They lose. His plan is foiled. Someone leaks the plan. The military knows what's happening. They capture John Brown. Eventually, they put him to death. Right? But John Brown is another crack in that frame that is showing violence is going to happen, right? The Civil War is on the verge because people are no longer diplomatically talking about stuff. Violence is occurring. So you've got Bleeding Kansas with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Border Ruffians fighting the New England Immigrant Aid Society, John Brown leading a charge until eventually he's dead, and then the final kind of nail in the coffin before we get to election of 1860. In the Senate, right, after Kansas, you have this speech by Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and he gives a speech called A Crime Against Kansas. And in the speech, Charles Sumner just attacks the South. In particular, he's going to attack Senator Brooks from South Carolina, right? And he just obliterates him, he makes fun of him, he attacks him, and eventually this gets heard by Senator Brooks' nephew, Preston Butler, right? Senator Butler, Preston Brooks is the nephew. So Preston Brooks hears this, and he gets angry, right? So what does he do? He goes into the Senate hearings, he takes a cane, he goes up to Charles Sumner for talking about his uncle, and he beats him with the cane, right? He beats him and beats him and beats him until he puts the Senator of the United States of America into a coma, right? He beats him out of consciousness. Charles Sumner gets put into to the hospital. Here's the kicker of it all, right? Brooks is treated as a hero. He's reelected, right? A man that should be put in jail not only because he attacked another man, but he attacked a U.S. senator, is reelected. He's praised. Charles Sumner, a man that's laid up in a hospital, right? He can't go to Senate. He's in the hospital. He gets reelected. This is the North and the South sticking it to the other side, saying, this guy's a criminal. This guy's in the hospital. We don't care because he's on our side. He's on our side. We hate the other side. This is showing cracks, right? We've got violence amongst the people, but when you have violence in the government, that is a completely different ballgame, right? And that's eventually going to lead us to the final piece of the government, and that's the election of 1860. Election of 1860, you have Abraham Lincoln, who's a Republican, the new Republican Party, who's taking over for the Whigs. You have Stephen Douglas, who's coming back again. He's a Democrat. You have John Breckinridge, who's also a Democrat. You have 2 Democrat parties. Reason being, Stephen Douglas is pro-popular sovereignty. The South does not like that, right? They are scared if you give popular sovereignty, then the people are going to vote against slavery. So John Breckinridge, he's going to get nominated by the Deep South, right? And those are also the Democrats. They pick him. John Bell is also in the game. He's a member of the Constitutional Union Party. So you have 4 people running, but mainly Lincoln, and you have 2 Democrats, right? Problematic for the Democrats. They're going to split the vote, right? If you have 2 people from one party, 1 from the other party, they're going to take votes away from each other, and Lincoln's going to win, right? The issue with this is Lincoln does not win the popular vote. Lincoln does not win any southern state, right? All the states that secede from the Union, Lincoln wins none of those states. So when they claim, right, we hear nowadays, modern day, not my president, Lincoln was not their president. None of them vote him, and they say, listen, here's a guy that's trying to take away our livelihood. He's taken away slavery. He's taken away our farming. We didn't vote for him, but yet somehow he's going to lead us. He's going to be our president. That's not fair, right? So they rebel, they secede, and that's going to bring us into the Civil War. Not only to show you kind of how much they hated Lincoln, Lincoln was not on the ballot on 7 states. Right? 7 southern states. You couldn't even vote for Abraham Lincoln. That's how much they disliked the guy. So that's going to be kind of the final nail in the coffin. We've got the issue building up with the Wilmot Proviso. What do we do with California? How do we separate it? Should we have slaves there? Should we not have slaves there? Should people have the right to vote? Should Congress get a say in it? Then you have violence amongst the people. Now you have people not only voting against each other, they're fighting each other. Ultimately, you have fighting in the Senate where people are upset, till you get to the final point where people say, you know what, no longer is the government listening to me. We don't want this guy to be my president. He is my president. We are done with this. We're upset. We're seceding. And that brings us to the Civil War. So those are our causes. We'll go over more of that later on in class in more detail, some of these specific things here. But answer the questions, and we are done.